Good morning. Today we're going to talk about plants and their evolution and how diverse of a species they are. So plants and green algae, or a green algae called caryophyceans, are thought to have evolved from a common ancestor. And there's evidence to support that they evolved from a common ancestor, first being that they both are photosynthetic eukaryotes. They both also contain chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and they both have chloroplasts, which we know are the organelles that are responsible for photosynthesis, and they both store starch and plastids, have cellulose to help support the plant, both found in their cell walls, and they also go through a reproductive cycle called the alternation of generations. Most of you are familiar with what plants look like, but early Earth consisted of a very different environment than the one that we are currently in. There was more carbon dioxide, there was more light, the environment was harsher, and throughout time, plants have adapted to first come from the ocean and move on to land. And by doing so, they had to evolve um, to these conditions. Algae, first of all, is a very unique organism or plant in that it is drought resistant. So algae can survive harsh environments or long duration without water. Um, so it kind of goes into a dormant period. Algae also has adapted to live above the water line, and that this is important because we know that life originated in the oceans and that at some point it had to move onto land to allow for the development of plants. And because it can live above the water line, there's thought to be some type of transitional organism between an organism that is, or species that is completely reliant on the ocean or water, and one that has grown to become less reliant and more adapted to live on land. There are benefits and challenges that arise with species now living on land. Uh, the environment, like I said, consists of an abundance of light and carbon dioxide. And on Earth, millions of years ago, there were relatively few pathogens that it could affect the species. But they also now, moving on land, had to be able to adapt to um, maintain moisture inside their cells. They became less dependent upon the water in which they originated from. They had to now develop a system to support their bodies. And we know that as roots, the stems, the leaves, and the flowering bodies, if it's an angiosperm. But they must also anchor their bodies in the soil and also develop a process to get the nutrients up through their roots and out into their leaves. And they needed to both obtain these resources from the soil and from the air. So, like I said, there were many difficulties that plants had to face in order to live on land. And so this slide demonstrates the problems that plants had in order to adapt to land, and then the solutions that they developed to do so. So there was a need for minerals, and so the plants developed roots to absorb water and then absorb these minerals to help the plant grow. They had to figure out how to adapt to gravity, which is a force that pushes down. So they developed lignin and cellulose in their cell walls to provide support for the plant. They had to increase their height to get light to grow. And they did that with developing the lignin and the cellulose in their cell walls, and also having the chloroplasts to help create photosynthesis or create energy that they needed. They adapted to be on a drier environment, and they developed a vascular transport system to do that, which consists of particular cells that allow water and nutrients to flow up to the roots and this through the roots and through the stem and through the leaves, and also supports or also has cells that support sugar or move sugar up through the roots to the leaves as well. They had to figure out how to reproduce on land instead of relying on a watery environment for reproduction. So they developed pollen, which contains the male reproductive cell for the sperm. Some plant characteristics that are common amongst all plants would be that they're multicellular, they contain many cells for different functions, that they're autotrophic, that they use photosynthesis to get their energy from the sun, that they contain chlorophyll A and B in their thylakoid membranes, and that they're surrounded by cell walls that contain cellulose for support, which is a polysaccharide. They store preserved food as amylose or starch, and that starch sometimes can be eaten as fruit. Plants are divided into two groups based on the presence or absence of this vascular support transport system within their body. So whether they have the ability to move nutrients and sugar up through the body of the plant, or they don't have this system. So plants that have this vascular transport system are called vascular plants, and plants that don't have this system are called non-vascular plants. A vascular system consists of two cells or groups of cells called tissues. The first being the xylem that carries the water and the minerals upward from the roots. And then the second being the phloem, which is the tissue that carries sugars made by photosynthesis from the leaves to where they'd be used or stored. One point, the xylem and the phloem are responsible for the tree rings. So if you've ever seen a tree that has fell and you were able to look and see the rings, you'll see that one for each year, it consists, if you're counting the rings, you'll have a dark ring and then you'll have a light ring. The dark ring is the phloem and the light ring is the xylem. And so for each set of those, it counts as a year. And if you start from the center of the tree and go out to where the bark starts, you can estimate on how old the tree would be dependent upon the xylem and the phloem or the vascular tissue inside the tree. Non-vascular plants are plants that don't have the xylem and the phloem, so they have no vascular tissue. These plants, because they have no vascular tissue, their growth is limited and they're usually close to the ground or very small. So these are your mosses, your ground cover. These are also called bryophytes, and these bryophytes require a constant moist environment in order to thrive and reproduce. Non-vascular plants also include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So these are plants that are also limited in growth, but are able to grow a little taller than the moss. But because they don't have any vascular tissue that can carry those nutrients up through the plant, they have to rely on other sources like absorption from the ground or the organism that they're living on. Seedless vascular plants, so these are plants that don't reproduce using seeds, but they reproduce using spores, are club mosses, horsetails, and then some ferns. And if you've ever had a fern where you bent it over on the backside of the fern, sometimes when it's going through its reproductive cycle, it will have little bumps, and those little bumps are the spores on the back of the fern plant. Seed-producing vascular plants, so these are vascular plants that produce seeds, include two groups. So you have your gymnosperms and your angiosperms. Your gymnosperms have a naked seed. They're the largest clade, or the largest clade are the conifers, or the cone-bearing plants. These are your pine trees, your spruce and your fir, and they have the cones, the pine cones that some of you might have picked up when you were a little kid. That would be your gymnosperms. And your angiosperms are going to have flowers that produce seeds, and these flowers are going to attract pollinators and then go through the process of fertilization to reproduce and produce more seeds or fruit. The main parts of vascular plants, I believe, are your shoots, so your stem and your leaves, and then your roots as well. Your shoots are found above the ground. They have leaves attached. and then there's the photosynthetic part of the plant. And we talked about photosynthesis with the leaves having being most exposed to the sun to absorb the sun, get the nutrients that it needs to turn it into that sugar. And then your roots are found below the ground, but they're going to spread out to anchor the plant in the ground. They're going to absorb water and minerals through the roots and then transport those water and minerals up to the top of the plant to be used to allow the plant to grow. But they provide a good support system in the soil to anchor that plant. Seed producing vascular system, or seed producing, I believe, we talked about gymnosperms. One of the most ancient species of gymnosperms would be your sequoia or your redwood trees. And if you ever get the opportunity to head out to California to go see them, it would be something that I think some of you might enjoy. But that would be gymnosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants. They have the bright flowers that most of you are used to seeing in the spring. Their seeds are formed when an ovule or an egg is fertilized by a pollen in the ovary. And usually that pollen gets transported by a pollinator onto the male part of the plant, or onto the female part of the plant, which is the stigma, and moves down the style and into the ovary. And then it is fertilized, and that ovary develops into a fruit, which contains the seed, and then the seed starts the whole process over again. There are distinct male and female parts on a flower, and most flowers, or if not all flowers, contain both the male and the female parts of the flower, or of the plant. Okay. Angiosperms can be divided into two groups. We have your monocots and your dicots, and there are specific characteristics with each one of these. One has a single seed cotyledon, the other one has a double seeded cotyledon. One has parallel veins in their leaves, the other does not. Flowers come in multiples of 3, which would be a characteristic of a monocot, and then multiples of 4 and 5 would be a characteristic of a dicot. Vascular tissue is in the cross section of the stem, and then vascular tissue would be in rings in a dicot in the cross section of their stem. So what that's talking about is if you were to cut a stem open, you would see that in a dicot it would have be in a circle, and then the vascular tissue would be in a bundle in a monocot. So that is the important information on section 17.1. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this lecture in regards to that. Please check Google Classroom for your assignment today, and I hope that you all are staying safe and healthy, and that I miss you, and I hope to see you guys back at school soon.